Greetings to you wherever you are. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. Before we start, I should acknowledge that the land on which this university is based is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and has never been bought or ceded from its original ownership. We respect the rights and traditions of the elders past, present and emerging. Today's a very exciting day. We have the very lively Professor Jessica Teets from Middlebury, who's going to be talking about local governance in China, on which, of course, she is one of the world's leading authorities. If you're interested, you can look up her website and see all her publications, but there is one in particular if anybody's interested in local governance, they have to read. It's her last chapter with William Hurst of, what's the book called, Jessica? Local Variations in Policy Implementation in China. That last chapter of that book from 2014, I recommend every time I speak at a workshop, because it is absolutely the starting point for everything you need to know about local governance in the last 10 years, including, of course, why central government is having problems with it, which is, I imagine, going to be part of what we have to say, what she has to say today. Before I hand over to her, can I just remind our audience that if you have questions or you have comments, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And when Jessica's finished speaking, we will put these questions and comments to her. And so, without further ado, over to the real authority on this topic. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, David. I will go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to be showing a number of charts taken from survey data. So like a lot of scholars in China these days, I've switched from mostly doing interviews to doing some interviews and more surveys. And so that's a lot of what you'll see today. So I wanted to talk about a new book manuscript that I'm in the process of writing. And I will go ahead and sort of dive into the structure of it so you can see what it is. So it's a fairly large book manuscript, fairly ambitious. That's usually my problem. And I'm working with this on this with Dr. Gao Xiang from Zhejiang University. We were playing around with titles still. I'm not very good at these titles, but we're basically trying to think about the governance model in China that is the next one after fragmented authoritarianism. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that old model looked like and then what we think this new model looks like. The book is in a couple of sections, and obviously I'm not going to try to pack in the entire book into one talk. What I was hoping to focus on today is really looking at strategic adaptation. So I will very, very briefly describe what this model looks like. But then what I really want to focus on is how much is this model actually being used at the local level? So lots of times things change at the central level, but then those changes never really make their way down to the local level. And so that's really what I want to try to focus on today is how much are things changing at the local level for policymaking? So the puzzle that we're trying to look at is during the reform era, we looked at the system that emerged as a fragmented authoritarianism system. And what this means is that we saw that the governing structure was fragmented from the central government down through each level of local government, as you can see here on the right-hand side. But it was also fragmented across policy areas with other ministries working on different issues. So for example, if we take an example from environmental policy making, something like water, for example, not only was the Ministry of Environmental Protection responsible for water, but so was Ministry of Natural Resources, Ministry of Agriculture, lots of other ministries also had oversight over water. At one point, there were as many as 26 different agencies that were regulating water in some way. And so that kind of fragmentation in the system meant that these agencies were oftentimes not coordinating with each other, but they were competing with each other. And this is just the logic of a bureaucracy. The more authority that I have, the bigger budget I get, and the more staff I get, and the more power I get in the overall system. So horizontally across different agencies or different ministries in the government, we saw that there was competition and not coordination. And then from the central level down through each level of local government, it was sort of like that children's game of telephone, right? Where the central government would pass a law, but as they passed it down through each level of government, it would be implemented at different speeds. Different parts of it would be implemented first, and sometimes it just wouldn't be implemented. And that leads to all of that variation that we talk about in the literature on local Chinese governance, about policy implementation gaps. And then the other problem that we saw in the system, in addition to just all the fragmentation and the inability to just make one rule at the central government and have everyone follow that same rule, was the lack of policymaking information. So because policymaking was fragmented across different agencies and at different levels of government, basically no one was really responsible for implementing any one particular law, right? There were lots of people responsible, meaning ultimately no one was responsible. And so for the central government, when they would look out at different policy areas, they didn't really understand how much the policy had been implemented, in which areas. And so there was this lack of policymaking information at the central government. So these were all the inherited problems then. So at the end of the reform era, when Xi Jinping takes over in 2012, 2013, these problems are well known. So they're well known to scholars like all of us who study this, but the Chinese government and Chinese elite also know about these problems. And so they engage in a process of political centralization where they try to remove the fragmentation from the system. So both the fragmentation in the authority, as well as trying to close those information gaps so that they actually know what's happening at the local level. And so what Gao Xiang and I are doing is we're reflecting back on this process that started in 2012, 2013, but really picked up steam in 2016. And we're trying to understand, does fragmented authoritarianism still explain policy outcomes in China, or do we need some sort of new model, some more centralized or coordinated model? So that's the puzzle that we try to engage with in the book. And there is a lot of literature on this in China. So in China, they don't talk about it as much as political centralization. Sometimes they'll call it political unification, but a lot of times they're calling it top-level design. So in that literature then of top-level design, what we're seeing is that most of the literature says, yes, there's centralization, but we still see that local governments are, doing what they want, and that we still see that there's competition over policy areas in the bureaucracy. So the Allers and Schubert review that they did is a really great resource for people who want to see what has changed and what hasn't. But what's really interesting is that, so if we look at the system overall, it looks like there are some changes, but pretty much things are the same. But when we look at certain key policy areas like the environment, poverty alleviation, zero COVID policy, in those areas for scholars who are tracing that policymaking process, they're showing a dramatically different policymaking process than we used to see under fragmented authoritarianism. This one is very coordinated and there's good information flows. And so what we're trying to look at then is, how does this policy-making process work? So one thing that we see in this new policy-making process is that the coordination is being done by leading small groups. The leading small groups, and I'll talk more about these, but the leading small groups have high-ranking membership. and they're being used to coordinate policymaking, both across the bureaucracy as well as down through every level of the local government. The way that they're doing this is they have the authority to run campaigns. And so they're able to pull government officials from other functional departments to work for them. And they also have their own source of funding. So they're not beholden to local budgets. So this really sort of pushes the local government to the side in that this leading small group during its campaigns can pull in human resources as well as fiscal resources. And so some people have started to talk about this model as maybe integrated fragmentation, basically that there's still fragmentation, but we're starting to see signs of more integration. And so this is what we're trying to look at then with this book manuscript. And basically what we argue is that there are two key institutional changes. One is what we call policy conglomeration. This is basically a process of reducing the fragmentation across the bureaucracy, right? So if there's a policy area like water, that you're going to concentrate that with the Ministry of Ecology and Environment and not have lots of other ministries that are responsible for it. So we see this creation of super ministries that are pulling in the tasks of other agencies. We also see that for this process of policy conglomeration, a lot of policy is being pulled through the leading small group structure away from the state and to the party. So the state becomes a policy implementer and the party is the sole policy maker. And this is also where we see that policy coordination. So this is where we see that the leading small groups using campaigns are coordinating policy both across the bureaucracy as well as down through each level of the local government. So a leading small group at the central level will establish branches at each level of government that report directly to them and not to the local government. And so what we argue then is we argue that Xi Jinping took these existing institutions. So we've seen, super ministry reforms in the past. We've also seen the use of leading small groups from the beginning of the People's Republic of China. We've also seen campaigns. So none of these things are new exactly. But what we see Xi Jinping doing is taking these types of institutions and he is converting them for new purposes. So he's trying to layer them in between the central government and the local governments and in between the party and the state to serve, we talk about it like connective tissue, like in your body, but basically as ways to coordinate policy and to facilitate those information flows. So this is what we're seeing. And the reason that we argue that this isn't just what we've seen in the past with super ministry reforms and leading small groups is that these are becoming permanent parts of the institution, permanent parts of the party structure. And so we're not seeing that these leading small groups are being dismantled. They're no longer ad hoc. Instead, we see that they're being converted into committees and that they're being given even more power and authority. So we argue that this is a key institutional change. And then what we try to do is we try to look down at the local level. Again, whatever's happening at the central level, does this really have any meaning at the local level? Is it changing anything? And we find that it is. So we find that it's increasing the pressure on local government officials, and it's also removing their policy authority. So increasingly, they're becoming like functional bureaucrats at the very bottom of the system and less like the grassroots cadres, doing policy experiments or things like that. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today is looking at how local government officials have adapted to this. So just because things are happening at the central level doesn't mean that every single one of those things is being fully accepted by local government officials. And so I want to look a little bit at what sorts of changes they are accepting, which sorts of changes they're trying to evade, and which sorts of changes they are defying in one way or another. And we do see, though, that the policy process is changing in China. It's hard in key policy areas to see a lot of the fragmentation. Now, it's still there in other policy areas that aren't key policy areas. But if it's a key policy area that Xi Jinping is talking about, we're seeing this increasingly coordinated policy process. Okay, so let me jump into the survey evidence that I'm going to be showing you in a series of charts. So we conducted a survey. We had almost 1,500 respondents from 28 provinces. And you can see that we had good variation as far as age, education level, position rank, and government level. We made sure that we had a representative sample by using all of the local government yearbooks so that we knew roughly how many people for local government officials were falling in different age categories, different position levels, education levels. So we do have a representative sample. For the survey, it was a fairly large survey, but we asked questions about centralization. So we tried to get at changes in policymaking authority. Who has this power now? What are people able to do at the local level? We also tried to get at local cadre behavior. So how do they view the incentive structure, both getting promoted as well as getting punished? Do they engage in policy innovation? All of these sorts of things. And then we also ask questions just about their job satisfaction. So we know that lots of people are taking the civil service exam each year, that this has been increasing over the last few years. And so, do we see that reflected in job satisfaction, that this is a good job? So those are the types of questions that we ask in the survey. And so that first institutional change that we talked about, I'm going to go quickly through this because I already highlighted it, but I just wanted to show an example. So when we talk about policy conglomeration, what does that look like? So for the environment, what we see is that there was the creation of this super ministry, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And if you look at all of the arrows, you can see that this ministry then was pulling certain policy authority from other places that used to be responsible for water, which was the example that I was giving you before. So we go from 26 different agencies responsible for water down to basically 2. And so that's that kind of consolidation of policy areas that we're looking at. And so what happens then is we see that you don't have that sort of competition over policy areas. One agency is responsible for that policy area, which also means they have accountability for what happens in that policy area. So we should expect to see more coordination and less competition, but also more accountability, right? That there will be consequences for not enacting certain rules or regulations. And then for the coordination change that we talked about, we do see that there are changes with the number of leading small groups. This chart that we put together is basically just looking at year of establishment. And so if you look at this time period after 2012, you see that, there's this increasing number of leading small groups being established. And I didn't put this chart in here, but also when we break them down by who's creating them, the state council versus the party, we see the vast majority of them after 2012 are being created in the party. So again, we see that leading small group structure being layered in between the party and the state and between the central government and local governments as a way to coordinate policy. And what we see with the capacity for these leading small groups is that because they're able to pool human resources from different functional bureaucracies, and they also have their own authority to fund their programs instead of relying on local government funding, they're actually very effective. A really great article to look at is the Tsai and Zhou article looking at integrated fragmentation and the role of leading small groups. They do a really good job of talking about sources of authority and these mechanisms to integrate policymaking. And then the last thing I wanted to mention about these leading small groups, why are they so powerful? In addition to having their own ability to staff and fund, they also are able to place key tasks or targets into the evaluation system for local government officials. And these remain in their evaluations over time. So even though the leading small group might not be as active, throughout, let's say, several years, those targets are being evaluated continuously. And there's better information being collected on those targets. And so what we see then is this ability to create pressure for local government to continue to enforce these policies. And so what do we see then in our surveys? Are all these institutional changes that we're talking about at the central level, are they being felt at the local level? So in this question, we just asked about the changing level of influence, with 1 being less influence, 2 being no change, and 3 being more influence. And what you can see is that we see this centralization, right? So who has the most influence in policymaking and local governance? It's discipline inspection, it's the higher level party offices, it's the upper levels. So that centralization that we see in the process of institutional change is being felt at the local level. So we see that. When we ask the importance of different factors in local policymaking, again, we see that, you know, the law and documents published by higher authorities, that these are really coming out on top. Things like your past experience, the experience of other local government officials, professional knowledge, right? Experts like us. All of those things have really dropped, and they're not very important in policymaking anymore. And it's really taking direction from the top. So again, this centralization is definitely being felt. We also see that there's increasing pressure. So this is where local government officials feel that they're responsible for everything, right? And so we see in our survey that they feel that they're under a lot of pressure to meet quantitative performance indicators and to avoid punishment, that there's this, because of the continuing anti-corruption campaign, there's this real fear about being held accountable and being punished. And so, you know, we saw this, that the government responded to this about the work fatigue syndrome, right? Where you saw record numbers of local government officials resigning or retiring early. And so what our survey finds is that this pressure has continued. So it's no longer in the news after like 2018, 2019, but we find that it's still there in the survey. And so you can see then the things that they're afraid of dealing with: conflict at higher levels, meeting their performance targets, fear of making mistakes. We also see that decreasing policy authority that we talked about, where the authority for making policy is being pulled up to the central level and also to the party and away from the state, that this is being felt at the local level as well. And so in our survey, again, you know, we asked about who is making policy, and you can see that local People's Congress, local people through feedback mechanisms, the news media, the local consultative Congress, or experts, you know, government scholars who are evaluating government programs and giving that sort of feedback. These all are reduced in importance, and instead it's really a story of centralization. And so at the local government, increasingly, they don't have policymaking authority even when it comes to policy implementation. So that's been pulled back from them. Now, this isn't all bad, right? So some of these things are good. So when we ask about changes over time, we see that that civil servants feel that the civil service is more standardized, right? So if you go into a department in one province and then the same department in another province, the rules are the same. We also see that there's a more professionalized group of civil servants. So that's good. And less corruption. That's good too. But what we see that isn't as good is we see that there's less influence on policymaking. So that process that we've talked about in the literature about local adaptation of policymaking being a key feature of China's resilient authoritarianism, as well as having local policy experiments and trying to solve policy problems that way, we see that both of these have dramatically decreased. And so we asked about a specific example because these are all really general questions, and we really wanted to try to get at what people meant by the fact that they were losing policy authority. So we asked an experimental question where we proposed that a new environmental policy was being passed, and that in the areas that had piloted this policy, we saw that there was harm, that this was a harmful policy to local people. And so then we said, okay, now you've been told that you need to implement this. What do you do? And so basically, you know, what we're seeing is that 38% of our respondents said, knowing that this will cause harm, I would implement it just like the central government wrote it. And 17%, said, yes, I'll implement it, but I just won't try to do a very good job. Sometimes I feel like that's my students. So we end up then with a fairly large percentage of local government respondents who would implement a policy that is proven to do harm. And so we find that very concerning, right? So we're seeing this sort of strict implementation at all costs. The only sort of harm that we saw that would slow implementation is if citizens were really discontented, so they were protesting. But the things that we see in the past, like that your economy wouldn't do very well or the local government would lose revenue, these things don't slow policy implementation in China anymore. And so this was a really revealing question where we see that this strict policy implementation is really being followed at the local level at all costs. And so what we find then in our survey data is we find two main strategic adaptations. One is what we were just talking about, that we see that local government officials are really focused on strict implementation of policy, and they're no longer really engaging in policy experiments. So we see that, provincial level policy pilots have decreased. The only sorts of policy experiments that we still see happening much in China are the ones that are solicited by the central government and overseen by the central government. So the days of, local governments trying to solve policies, and if they do, then trying to diffuse that policy to other places, that really has disappeared. One of the most famous policy experiments, of course, is illustrated in this image, looking at the special economic zones. So in the ways that China tried to transition to a market economy, they were able to experiment with different versions of that in different places before rolling it out to the entire country. Increasingly, though, we see that local government officials are not doing this unless it's been approved by the central government. So that's one thing. So we see strict implementation of policy as written from the central government without trying to adapt it, and very little effort to try to solve local problems. Instead, we see this sort of paralysis where they ask for policy from above and then sit and wait until it comes. The other thing that we see, the other main adaptation, is we see a lot of what in the literature it's called different things. We're calling it formalism here, or sometimes we call it work report culture. But basically what we're seeing is that because local government officials have such high levels of uncertainty and fear of punishment, and most of their evaluation targets have become quantitative, what seems to be happening is that they tend to stay in their offices and upload work reports talking about the work that needs to be done, versus being like grassroots cadres going out into the local community, trying to understand what the problems are and trying to develop solutions. And so, in my limited number of interviews that I was able to do, this is basically the idea of, the more that you try to do, the more potential mistakes you have and the higher likelihood that you'll draw attention and get punished. So increasingly what we see are people filing work reports. And so in our survey, we're seeing that they're spending about 40% of a 40-hour work week just filing work reports. So not actually doing work, but filing these reports to upper levels of government. And sometimes these targets are sort of silly. Like in the targeted poverty alleviation campaign, they had to do, I forget what it was, at a certain time period, maybe monthly visits to these low-income families to check in on them. And so what local government officials started doing was they would go to these houses, they would take a picture in front of it, and they would just upload the picture to say, yes, I went there. But they wouldn't actually try to understand what was happening with the local family, whether they had slipped back into poverty or what sorts of new problems they might be facing. So they're sort of checking a box saying, yes, I did this, without trying to actually implement the policy or find out where the policy is not working. So that source of local policymaking feedback that we used to see from the local level also has gone away. So what are the implications then of these changes? So first of all, we see that the changes in policymaking at the central level, these are resulting in changes at the local level. They are being felt. This isn't just political rhetoric about, Xi Jinping's governance style or top-level design. These are real changes that are changing people's behavior at the local level. And we see that there is strict implementation of policies more than experimentation. But unfortunately, we also see that there's more formalism. So people just filing quantitative updates on their performance evaluations instead of actually trying to solve the policies. And these are some of the challenges that they identified in the survey. So what does all of this mean? Well, one problem that we see, and lots of people have written about this in the environmental space, Denise van der Kamp and Isaac Ding have both written about what they're seeing with environmental policymaking. And Ma Xiao also called it policy implementation deformation. And so what all of these people are finding is what we're finding too, which is that local policymakers seem to veer erratically from overcompliance, trying to signal that they're strictly implementing these policies exactly as written at the central level, and paralysis, doing nothing. So the problem is that overcompliance is not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes it results in really bad outcomes. Like in Denise's book, she looks at the economic toll of simply shutting down entire sectors, whether or not those factories have been improving their pollution emissions, whether they've invested in new technology. It doesn't matter. If you're in that sector, you get shut down. So what investment do you have then to try to update your equipment and not to pollute? And so these are some of the problems that we see, but we also see this paralysis. So there's overcompliance, but there's also paralysis. And this is where even though the local government can see that there's a problem, they won't address it because they haven't been given instructions from above. So this is the problem then that we see, that even though there's more coordination and more compliance at the local level, it's resulting in sort of veering between this overcompliance and this paralysis. And this is really problematic. And so, if we just look again at environmental policymaking as an example, if we look at the new environmental policies that were passed and then the enforcement campaigns that happened, between like 2016 and 2017 were the first round of these campaigns to make sure that people were enforcing these new regulations. What we saw was that the regulations were all implemented really quickly. There were lots of fines, lots of factories were shut down. But what then also happened is entire industries were lost, and people lost their jobs. And so we see that there was this huge impact. And it's not that isn't something that you're willing to trade off, right? So if you're trying to reform the environment, maybe you're willing to take some economic hits. But what most scholars who study this area found is that there wasn't any sort of feedback from the local government where if they could have implemented maybe in a longer time frame or certain sectors versus other sectors, that they might have been able to get both things. They might have been able to get better pollution control and environmental governance. At the same time, they could have kept people's jobs and they could have kept those companies open. So basically what we see then is this really high likelihood of unforced errors. And I'm happy to talk about other policy areas too, but like the zero COVID policy is a really good example. So if there had been local feedback on local adaptation, you might have seen that there weren't so many unforced errors, right? People didn't need to die in apartment buildings because they were locked in without medication or there was a fire. These were all unforced errors that were unnecessary. But this particular way of making policy increases the likelihood of these unforced errors, unless this model is changed to create more feedback from the local level. So what does this look like? So again, I had pointed out in the literature, we already have this idea of integrated fragmentation. we differ from this a little bit. I'll explain the pictures of, Mao plus Deng equals Xi Jinping. But what we're seeing is that we see this new policy model in Xi Jinping's key policy initiatives. But we're starting to see that more and more policy areas are being changed into this format. So, for example, in the last National People's Congress, we saw that other leading small groups were announced. So, like petitions and letters, which used to be a feedback mechanism for the local state from local people, has now been pulled over into a party-led leading small group. And so we're starting to see that more and more policy areas are being transformed in this way. And so what we're arguing is that the fragmentation is going to keep disappearing. There will be fewer and fewer policy areas where we still see fragmentation, and the integration and coordination is going to expand. So that's what we see. But we want to point out that while this model and these results are new, the tools are not new. And so we need to make sure that we talk about them in the historical lineage. I know a lot of times political scientists don't like to talk about a historical lineage, but these tools like campaigns and leading small groups, all of these things have been used in the past. What's different is that the tools are being repurposed for new goals. This is a picture of Xi Jinping from Yunnan, where I do a lot of field work, looking at Lake Arhai and talking about how he wants the lake to be healthy, and that when he returns in a few years, he wants it to look just like this. But this is pretty reminiscent of like Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, right? Like these tours and these campaigns, these are not new, but they are being repurposed in different ways. And so what we are seeing that's different is we're seeing that more information is being collected, partially through this governance structure, but also Xi Jinping has invested a lot in digital monitoring and other forms of monitoring for local government officials. We covered this in the book manuscript as well. And so we have more information, and then we also have more aligned incentives. So we see that the leading small group is aligning incentives by placing those key targets or performance indicators into the evaluation system. And so what we are talking about then when we evaluate this entire system is that this is a process of institutional change. So we are going to see that some policy areas move more quickly than others. We're also going to see this process of friction, or what we've called strategic adaptation, on the part of local rule takers, right? And so local government officials do have ways to resist, they have ways to avoid, and then also they have ways to adopt. And so that's what we're trying to do with our research, is try to figure out where these areas are and what that adaptation looks like. And so this is where I explain the pictures. So basically what we're arguing is this process of institutional change, it's a negotiated process. And even though it's using Mao's tools, right, campaigns, leading small groups, inspection campaigns, these are all tools that Mao Zedong used, but they're being used to reach Deng Xiaoping's goals of institutionalization, or rule by law, right? That the whole system functions much more like a bureaucracy that follows rules and things are standard across the bureaucracy. And so the difference, of course, is that Deng Xiaoping was looking to institutionalize the state bureaucracy, and what we see under Xi Jinping is that institutionalization is happening with the party as the center of authority and not the state. The state is the loser in this process. So this is what we find then, as far as this new model. And again, it's a process of institutional change. So it's not linear or fast or smooth. And so what we try to do in the book manuscript is evaluate how the incentive structure is changing, the policymaking the policymaking structure is changing, and also how the central government is getting more information about what's happening at the local government. So I'll go ahead and stop there and stop sharing my screen.